In this video, I'm going to be discussing my own views on certain metaphysical questions, particularly the subject of skepticism of God. And I'm going to be applying Popperian logic because this is how I tend to view the world and how I'm more confident in approaching metaphysical questions, because I don't want to believe something that's very distal and that's hard to know and that might not actually have practical applications in my daily life. And how I go about viewing the truth claim of whether or not God exists particularly has to do with applying a Popperian logic, which when Popper was analyzing scientific hypothesis, he said that you have to set up two hypotheses. You have a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. And a null hypothesis refers to when you're assessing a relationship between two phenomenon, you assume by default that there's no relationship between those two phenomenon. And the second, the alternative hypothesis, is that there is a relationship between those two phenomena. So from my phenomenal experience, I haven't experienced God. And even if I did have an experience of God, it's hard to know whether or not that experience could be distinguished from some other phenomenon. But before we get there, let's just start with the basics. So I don't have this relationship with God. That would be the null hypothesis. I retain that, and that's basically where my skepticism starts. But an alternative hypothesis would stipulate that I do have a relationship with God, and that's why one might believe. And when it comes to the believer, and this I think is perfectly fine, when you do have belief or something like faith, oftentimes what you're doing is that you're not concerned as much with truth. You're more concerned with making an argument based off faith. And this is something that I'm skeptical of, and I don't think it uh, provides any pragmatic benefit for me. And I'll get into that going forward, because when you set up any sort of truth claim, or you want to know if it's true, like, it's important to also define what you mean. And if you're applying more, and I tend to be more convinced by scientific claims and a scientific view of the world to help differentiate what certain phenomena are, it's important to operationally define what you mean. And even before you get to the this having a scientific discussion, it's important to also do that. So even in philosophical conversations, it's important to be able to specify exactly what you mean by a certain term. So when it comes to God, there's multiple types of gods that you could be talking about. You could be talking about a pantheistic God, which refers to some sort of universal or natural conception of God, and that could be confined, say, to the earth. It could be more of this conception that the earth is conscious and perceiving and created us. Or it could be that the universe is conscious and perceiving. So like maybe the moon has a consciousness. But if what you're doing is you're confining the God to the earth, then you can have planets out there potentially that have life that could also have a conscious or perceptual system, and then bring about life to it, right? And then that would create more of a polypantheistic type of notion of gods. So you can have these different gods that could potentially compete with each other. But then you could also have more anthropomorphized forms of gods like Zeus or Helios, right? Who have these human embodied forms and have special powers, but also who don't have all the features of other types of gods, like the Christian God, who sometimes has this personified anthropomorphized form. Okay, it's important to define also what you mean about God, because God could be all these different things, and just saying that you believe in God, it's not clear exactly what's meant by that. And so for me, that's immediately a red flag. It's difficult to figure out, okay, what do I even mean by this? It's important to define it, and this doesn't really help me in my daily life in any meaningful way. And because of that, I have skepticism of that, and I think it's important to, when communicating this idea, to even and useful to bring up a scientific framework, because I don't personally have a relationship with God, but somebody else might have religious experiences which allow them to have a relationship with God. And even if I were to have something that I think were akin to a religious experience, which I have had more spiritual experiences through the use of cannabis, but they're not anything that has shifted my perceptions radically. I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything. And even if I did, when I go dial back my assumptions, I know that there's a physical substance that's changing, altering my perception, say, of time, and sometimes changing the way I think in more radical ways, in ways that when I calm down or that settles and I enter sobriety, I can think more clearly about. So when it comes to uh, understanding even our own perceptions, it's important to have skepticism of what we're actually perceiving outside in the environment. And other people might say take psychedelics and have an experience that, to me, I would perceive as induced by the substance rather than being something that is a direct experience of God, right? Because they're ingesting a physical substance, it's interacting with their neural receptors and their synapses, and that's changing their brain chemistry. It's disordering their perceptions and sensations of reality, and then that's what ultimately brings back or brings about a religious experience. So that, I think, is very different than having a direct experience with, say, a divine figure or a deity. And when it comes to even other, it's hard to distinguish other religious experiences that you might have even without psychedelics, say in a dream that's very vivid, like a lucid dream, in which certain aspects of reality are suspended. Like maybe you can fly or you can jump really high, and then when you hit the ground, you bounce almost like a trampoline. And I've had some pretty vivid dreams before, but none of which I would take as evidence to be God. And this is why I think it's really important to apply a Popperian skepticism to this, because even when you do have, say, some confirmation evidence for the alternative hypothesis, what you have to do is then you have to test it multiple times in an attempt to falsify it, to add variation to your scientific process, to be able to actually properly also adjust your definition of what God is, as well as to develop credence and confidence in that belief. And I think it's perfectly fine to even not apply a Popperian logic. This is how I personally go about communicating my skepticism, to be able to try to make sense of what I believe to other people and communicate that clearly, because I don't believe in God, and I don't believe in God for my own personal and practical reasons. But I think that when you use a scientific logic, particularly a scientific logic that stems from the philosophy of science, it helps to really organize and clarify arguments in a way that, to me, makes a lot of sense, because my starting position has a lot more to do with my direct empiricism, so my direct experiences of reality. And because I don't have a perception of God, put very simply, and I don't have a working definition of God, this is my fundamental starting point. I just have no reason to believe in God. And belief in God doesn't make any sense to me in that manner. And I think that when you start to take these a little bit further and you try to say prove a God, and you want to go to an aspect of proof, it falls through, because you have to have a working definition that you can test, and then you have to be able to subject that working definition to multiple tests that allow for different variations using a method of falsification. So it goes kind of against faith or belief ultimately. So put simply, that's my argument for um, why I think why I'm skeptical of God, and why I think that other people who want to believe in God because God is true should consider looking at it more of a Popperian logic. If what you're concerned ultimately is what the truth is, rather than believing in God out of a faith-based claim because you get something else out of religion that can be valuable, and I think that there are reasons for some people to believe in God that you don't necessarily have to have truth, because I think that the fundamental difference between faith and truth, and having a knowledge claim or a justified truth, true belief, has a lot more to do with something that sometimes goes against our factual ways of knowing the world through empirical methods that utilize things like science or empirical philosophy. So it goes against things like direct experience. And it has more to do with pragmatism, the utility of a belief, rather than it has to do with knowing whether or not a God is true for certain. Because some people who have religious faith will engage in certain behaviors that they may not otherwise that help proliferate their life, such as gratitude. But I don't think that you need a God to be able to engage in a gratitude practice. I don't think that you need a God, say, to do something ethical or behave ethically in the world. I think that there are mediators out there. A mediator is a variable that you might not have considered in a particular relationship. So there is a relationship between religiosity and increased well-being. It's a relatively small relationship, but there's also mediators. Things like gratitude practice and experience of gratitude mediates that relationship. So if you're practicing gratitude and you're an atheist, you might have a longer lifespan. You might experience similar benefits to a religious person who is experiencing gratitude. So that's all I wanted to say on these subjects. Bye.